Breakout at the iron trestle. The chain lifted like a snake when the wind came through the cut, links rattling a thin metal prayer against the dark. The moon hung low and pale, a cold coin above the bluffs, and below it the trestle stood like ribs, holding the night up over the small river that chewed at stone with a steady mouth. On the far side of the span, a lantern swung from a hook on a guard post, its glow throwing long, trembling bones of light across the rails. A line of figures moved along the track, wrists cuffed, ankles linked, steps taught by pain to land together. Near the middle of the line, one figure counted the ties underfoot and the beats between lantern sways, because counting steadies the hand when a plan must land inside a single breath. The guard at the lantern yawned and shifted his weight. Boots scuffed grit. Another guard on the near bank swore at a fly that refused to learn manners. The man in the shackles took a slow breath and felt for the small lump of lard tucked into the cuff seam by fingers that had held a knife and a needle earlier that day. A thumb worked it into the hinge, and the hinge learned the language of mercy. 2 ties more. The river below moved with a sound like a coat being shaken out by a patient hand. The wind pulled at the chain again. The guard looked up at the moon. The figure in the cuffs did not look up at anything. He looked down and counted. Days earlier, the town had watched a wagon roll in with its sides high and its door barred. Men in long coats had climbed down off the seat and read a paper with words about debt and duty, and the way a man can be asked to pay off both by lifting rock until his back learned to sing. The badge had stood on the porch and said nothing. A woman with a white apron had stood in her doorway and said even less. In the shade behind the livery, the rider listened to the paper and the silence and turned a length of rope in a hand until it lay flat and easy, like a thought that knows its own shape. The mine had been hungry all summer. The company ledger had too many lines you could not rub out. When the pack from the plateaus stopped coming, a new hunger took their place, a hunger with ink and stamps and deputies. The badge had tried to argue the law with men who wore it like a borrowed coat, and found that borrowed coats still keep off rain. By dusk, 4 men were on the wagon and the bar was set. The rider watched the wheel ruts and the way dust fell back into them, and decided that he had no taste left for letting wheels run without a bump. The woman in the apron had a hand for stitching and another for steadying a wire saw while it hid inside a loaf of bread. She did both without telling the bread what it held. The stable boy had a way of wrapping wheel rims in old leather until they forgot how to sing. He wrapped a pair and slid them under a cart that did not belong to him yet. The old tracker walked the cut where the rails kissed the trestle, and counted bolts and rats and places where a man could lie flat and become a shadow so thin even the wind would forget to touch it. The rider took a length of chain and a bucket of grease and a handful of iron filings and taught them a prayer. The man in the cuffs had been caught on a road where men disappear into rules. He had not fought at the foot of the wagon. He had saved stubborn for a plank with a number painted on it. When the wagon stopped at the small yard by the water tower, the rider was there in a coat that looked like any other hand stained with creosote from a day of laying ties, head bent like a man who has forgotten sky. 2 glances met and exchanged a plan without the shame of words. The rider disappeared beneath the tank with a bundle of rags and a wrench that had a voice when it met a nut. The man in cuffs did not look after him. He counted the ticks of a drip inside the tower and filed each sound in a place where action would later go to fetch a reason. The wagon moved at dawn, with the bar still set. Men walked behind it with rifles cradled and a boredom that makes the finger loose. They took the longer road to the trestle, the one that crossed the river high on iron legs, because shorter roads had learned to hide the kind of things that tip a man out of a saddle at the wrong time. The rider was waiting beyond the first bend where sage grows low and stones red as old blood sit half buried like teeth. He set a small brush fire there with a wick soaked in oil and a timing that had no room for pride. The smoke rose just enough to make men sneeze and look away from their feet, and that was all smoke needed to do that morning. In the clinic, the woman in the apron told a boy to keep the kettle ready and the water clean. She tied a strip of linen around her hair and slipped a small tin into her pocket. Inside the tin was ash, mixed with salt, because ash blinds and salt makes eyes remember lessons. The badge leaned on the porch rail and looked out at the empty road and thought about hinges and what kind of movement makes a door a door. The old tracker sat with a string of cans on his knee and threaded them onto a cord without letting them sing. The stable boy tuned a wheel until it turned without telling anyone where it was going. The plan had 3 knots. The first knot lay under the water tower, where the rider loosened the great bolts that held the spout hinge to its collar by a turn and a half. The second knot lay inside a loaf of bread that had a saw and a smell of yeast, and a score on the crust in the shape of a letter that meant now. The third knot lay on the trestle itself, where a chain had been set tight and swallowed under gravel between a tie and a brace, with a hook welded to a ring that could be pulled by a hand that did not belong there. A good plan lives like a net. If one knot slips, another holds enough to keep a body from going over the edge. At midday, heat rose in shimmering sheets. The wagon rolled under the water tower. The men on the ground did not notice the rider walk past them with a coil of rope over his shoulder and a nail in his teeth like any rough hand. They did not notice the spout swing an inch lower when the tank keeper cranked it. They did not notice the way the rider looked at a single bolt, as if it were a face. The spout came down, the water hissed into the barrel, the keeper cursed the way it stuck before it came free. And none of that mattered much at the time. Most of the work that changes a day looks like it does not matter at all until the hour shows up when it does. The bread came with the evening stew, and hands ate quickly, and no one watched anyone else be careful with crust. The saw slipped from heel to palm, the palm to cuff, the cuff to hinge, hinge to smile hidden behind a cough. A dive into the chain at the ankles would have made noise enough to wake birds in the next county. The man did not dive. He looked at a screw head and a pin and saw that time is a tool like any other, if you know how to hold it. He made a little space where the pin had been peened, and inside that space he felt the stubborn give that makes metal a living thing. He did not free it. He taught it how to want to be free when someone else tugged the right way at the right time. They moved out before midnight because men who fear the dark like to be done by dawn. The moon came late and thin. The wind ran between the legs of the trestle and made a throat noise. The lantern at the far post swung. The man with the loosened cuff counted ties and breaths. The rider lay flat under the deck with his face pressed to the cool wood and his fingers on the chain hook that had a ring to pull. He could smell the grease and filing still on his hands, the iron in the river, the old smoke in the beams. He could hear the click of a hook on a guard belt with each step. He waited until the belt and the chain were sharing a heartbeat. The first tug came at the moment the lantern hit the far swing of its arc. The second tug came when the guard scratched his neck. The third tug came when the line of men put weight on the next tie. The hook lifted the ring, slid the chain that linked ankles one to the next, slackened where it mattered, and the man with the cuff that wanted to be free let his wrist twist just enough for the hinge to finish what the lard had taught it to start. The link opened. The guard at the near post turned his head to spit. The man with the open wrist did not run. He stumbled. The stumble was the plan. He fell into the man behind him, and that man made a sound, and the guard half turned and took a step with the wrong foot, and met a spot on the deck that had been waxed with a smear of fat laid down the afternoon before by a hand that had looked like it was just wiping dust. The guard slid. His lantern fell and swung back hard on its hook, and the hook bent 2 fingers, and that guard yelled. Yelling is like a bell. It calls things you did not mean to invite. It also hides smaller sounds, like the scrape of a wire saw inside a line of bodies that had learned to sway together, and could sway a little longer if the world needed it. At the far post, the second guard lifted his rifle. The rider under the deck put both hands on the chain and pulled until his teeth sang. The ring cleared the bracket and dropped. The midsection of the shackled chain, loosest where weight had not had time to set it, fell away from the deck and went slack between ankles for the length of one breath. That was enough air for a decision. The man with the open wrist rolled to the side and let that slack feed through his ankles until he could stand as if he were still tied to the line, while being less so than he had been a blink ago. The man behind him felt what he felt and copied it because some lessons fly faster than hawks in the dark. The second guard fired. The flare lit the world white for the length of a heartbeat. The shot went high because a tiny drop of oil on the sight had moved into the notch at the wrong second when the lantern swung. The rider under the deck took that light into his eyes and did not blink. He pulled again on the chain ring as the bodies above shifted. Above him, the first man in the line tossed his weight at the hand of the guard whose fingers had been bent, and that hand let go of the hook on the lantern post, and the lantern sailed out over the river and dropped and hissed and went to sleep. Dark rushed in. The far guard swore. The near guard tried to stand and found the wax again. The man with the loose wrist grabbed the near guard's sleeve with both hands as if to beg. The guard tore his arm away and stepped into the exact space where the rider had pulled the chain under the deck. His boot heel caught the chain, and the chain caught his balance and twisted it into the air, and his rifle went to the boards and his head followed and kissed the rail. He slept without dreaming for a while after that. The line of men moved like a snake that has been cut and is still unhappy. Two scrambled. One froze. The one who froze did not stay frozen, because the hand with the loose cuff found his elbow and dragged him into motion with a promise made without words. The far guard fired again. Wood spat splinters. Sparks leaped and died. From the cut above the trestle, the old tracker pulled a string and set a small cascade of gravel in motion. It rattled down the slope and into the brush and made the noise a man makes when he tries to find a footing he cannot see. The far guard swung his rifle toward that new noise, because the world had just gotten too full to hold still. The rider rolled out from under the deck on the near bank. The badge rose from the shadows by a stack of ties and stepped into the space between the far guard and the line without offering a silhouette that wanted a bullet. The woman in the apron slid down the bank with the tin of ash and salt in her hand. She moved without making the river grass tell on her. She moved the way a person moves who knows where to put knees and elbows when a room is crowded with things that can tip. She reached the first body she could in the line, pressed the tin into a palm, and said a word that meant throw when you cannot see. The far guard fired again, faster now, the rhythm of someone trying to shut a door with bullets. He missed what he needed to hit and hit what did not mind much either way. He would have hit what mattered next if the spout on the water tower had not been looser than a decent spout should be. At that exact second, the keeper up the line, who had come to see what the yelling meant, swung the crank to test the hinge because a sound from the tower had bothered him all day, in a way he could not explain. The hinge slipped. The spout swung. A tongue of water hissed out into the night for a breath before the keeper swore and hauled it back. That breath sent a sheet of spray over the rails on the trestle near the far bank and turned the boards to soap. The far guard took a step that trusted wood too much. His boots went out from under him, and his rifle clattered and slid toward the gap where moonlight looked up like an eye. The line broke then, but not toward the dark where men disappear. It broke toward the near bank where a cart with wrapped wheels waited, and beyond the cart, a stand of brush held a door nobody would recognize unless they had cut it themselves. The rider grabbed the man with the slowest feet. The badge shoved the cart. The tracker yanked a cord so cans sang and told someone far off that it was time to light a fuse, and the woman in the apron ran guard on the flank with a strip of linen in her hand like a flag no army had ever seen. The cart rolled without talking. It had been greased in all the right places and made quiet by hands that believed in quiet more than most churchgoers believe in sermons. Down the small slope it went, over a scant ditch that had been shaped by boot heels all afternoon, into the mouth of the brush where branches had been bent and coaxed, until they made a tunnel that smelled like dust and sap and relief. One by one, bodies slid into that tunnel and became shadows, then roots, then whispers. The badge went last, turned, and looked at the trestle where the near guard was waking up into a world that would make little sense for a long time. The badge said a thing nobody heard, and then slid into the brush. Pursuit came quickly, but it came by the book, and the book had pages missing for anyone who thought this town could not write some of its own. A pair of riders crossed the river at the shallow and tethered horses where sage grew high. They came along the rails with boots heavy and eyes quick, and pushed branches where branches did not want to be pushed. They found the tunnel. They found the cart tracks. They went into the green with rifles low and shoulders tight. For 5 steps, the tunnel held like a hallway with a floor. On the 6th, the floor went away because it had been flooring only for people who knew where to put their weight. The riders fell into a trench dug with shovels that had worked quietly while the sun was still fat, and the trench held them the way a hand holds something that should not be let loose until morning. The tunnel spit the town's new fugitives into a dry wash, where moonlight did not brave to stay. The rider took point. The man with the loose cuff kept a hand on the cart, because sometimes touching something is the only way to stop the part of the mind that wants to float away. The woman in the apron counted breaths and bodies, and the small quakes in the knees of men who had not eaten well in a while. The badge kept both ears open to the idea that a promise had been made without a word just now, and might need keeping in odd ways before the sun got up. They made the old flume by a low cut, and followed it to the granary where a door had been set into the back wall that nobody could see from the road, unless they were blessed by luck or cursed by knowing too much. Inside the granary, sacks of oats stood like short men in rows. Between two rows, a ladder dropped into a pit that smelled of dry wood and old apples. At the bottom, a tunnel ran under the road and came up in the root cellar of a house that had taught people to be quiet long before the law turned talking into a risk. In that cellar, there were jars lined up on shelves and a cot and a pan of water and a lamp with a hood. Somebody had set bread there that morning. Somebody had known that the night would need feeding. They breathed. The woman in the apron washed wrists where iron had kissed skin too often. The man with the loose cuff swallowed without chewing, and then looked at the rider for the first time. He did not speak. The rider nodded once and set a hand on his shoulder, and left it there for 3 breaths. The badge stood by the ladder and listened to sounds that were not footsteps, like the sigh a house makes when it decides it can bear one more hour of worry before it has to creak. The old tracker slipped up to the yard and tasted the air for men who do not belong in a kitchen garden, then came back down and traded a look that said later and soon in the same blink. Later came sooner than anyone wanted. The company men who had lost their line did not lose their anger. They went to the office and put new words on old papers, and took the badge's chair for a minute without asking. They said something about jurisdiction. They said something about obstruction. They said a thing with teeth in it about consequences. The badge listened and did not move his face. When they were finished, he said a single line that did not seem to belong in that room but did. And then he left the office and closed the door, and did not lock it because locks are for fear. And he had chosen his fear, and it did not live in that room anymore. Night stretched. In the cellar, the lamp burned low under its hood. The rider slept in strips and woke at every strip's end to count a rhythm that no longer matched the trestle lantern's sway. The woman in the apron sat with her back against the shelves and let her head tip, and then jerked it up and smiled at herself like a person who knows where the limits are and where they are not. The man with the loose cuff dreamed about water running over iron and woke with his mouth dry. The badge stood at the top of the ladder once and looked at the stars, and at the road, and at the dark yard, and thought about trestles and cuts and how a town stands in odds and ends of wood and courage if you let it try. Before dawn, they moved again. The company would search houses. It would ask questions with the flat voice of a ledger. The cellar had done its work. It was time to use the last knot in the net, the one nobody had tested yet, because you do not test the bridge you mean to cross only once. They took the back way to the old quarry where night stays late, bodies in single file, steps careful, hearts loud. They reached the rim as the east turned pale. Down in the bottom, a pool lay still and black as a pupil. On the far side, a drainage cut ran out toward the high plains. It had been the path for rain when storms had bothered to visit. Now it was dry as a promise not yet kept. The old tracker had walked it 2 days ago and said it would take a man on hands and knees for a while, and then let him stand. And after that, the land would open enough for the kind of riding that makes thoughts big again. They climbed down on a ladder made from old fence staves roped together, each rung testing a plan with a creak. At the bottom, the air was cool and smelled like old stone and a little like a forgotten apple. They moved along the cut, shoulders brushing rock that had seen everything and told no one. Above them, the world confused itself for a while, because the company men knocked on doors where nobody answered, even though somebody stood just inside. and held a breath until it almost went stale. And the men at the trestle pointed at wax on boards and grease on chains and shouted words that did not fix wood or metal. And a keeper at the water tower took a wrench to a hinge and muttered to it like it had done him a personal wrong. The cut gave them a gift when the sun reached it. It opened into a long, shallow draw full of scrub and grass and rabbit runs. Beyond that draw, a line of cottonwoods marked a creek that could be followed to a ridge that forgot about law for a while. The rider went up first and waved an arm. The man with the loose cuff followed with a fist still clenched like the cuff was there, and he could not teach his hand to forgive the air. The woman in the apron came last and did not look back, because looking back is sometimes a lie you tell your feet, so they forget which way is forward. At the creek, 2 ponies waited with reins caught over branches and heads down, chewing patience. The stable boy had walked them here in the dark and left a note under a rock that said, "The thing notes say when they are written by hands that have decided to be brave." The badge kissed a finger and touched the note and put it in a pocket, and did not show his face to the east for a moment, because sometimes a person needs to remember how to do that without practicing. They crossed the ridge by a game trail that braided between prickly pear and old fire scars. The plains opened. The sky choked the word sky. A hawk cut the air in a way that made the heart want to lift and go after it. They did not. They kept low and set the ponies to a steady trot that could be kept for hours without making lungs hate. The old tracker drifted like smoke to the left and right, checking the script of the ground for other readers. He found only deer and coyote and the faint ghost of a wagon wheel that had no reason to be as far out as it was. He came back to the line and said the thing his face had said all morning: "Keep moving." By noon, they reached a small basin where heat sits in a bowl, and the air tastes like pennies. Here the plan had its last test. The company men would assume west because west is where men think freedom lives. The rider did not go west. The rider turned north and then slid east for a while along a dry ridge, and then south again into a line of low hills that looked like sleeping animals. This was not bravery. It was humility toward the map written by wind on grass. Men who let the land suggest do not need to be as bold as men who try to tell it what to be. They camped under a ledge as the light got the color of old copper. Fire was not invited. Water was shared. Bread broke. Salt licked from a palm tasted like something earned. The man with the loose cuff sat with his back to rock and let his hand open finally and watched it like a thing he had not owned fully in a while. The woman in the apron dozed and woke and pressed a palm to the rider's shoulder without thinking, as if to make sure the plan was still there and had not ridden off in the night the way plans sometimes do when no one is looking. The badge stood and watched the horizon and counted a rhythm he did not know he was counting until it stopped being numbers and started being a thing like peace. Dawn took a long time to climb the hills. When it did, the world came back into the kind of focus that makes people remember bills and roofs and seasons. The ridge ahead led to a valley with a thin river and a stand of willow. Beyond that, the long gray line of a road the company did not own. The rider turned in the saddle and looked back at the land that had held them through the dark. Somewhere behind that land a trestle stood, and a hinge got tightened and a paper got written and tacked to a post where it would curl at the corners and then fall and be swept up by a hand that had dishes to do and time only for what mattered. Somewhere a boy put his ear to a door and learned what the weight of a breath sounds like when it is shared. They did not ride into any town with hats high. They did not lift hands and call victory. They rode past a low bluff and down to the river and let the ponies drink while they filled a canteen. The rider took a piece of cloth from a pocket and wrapped the man's wrist where the metal had done a mean job. The woman in the apron tied it the way you tie a bandage that you want to hold but not punish. The badge said there was a station 2 days east where a train would not ask enough questions, and a road north where the company had no friends. The old tracker pointed to a stand of cottonwood off the valley floor and said someone with the right kind of smile and the wrong kind of stories could hide there for a week, and no one would learn a single name they could write on a list. The man with the loose cuff looked at the rider, and then at the woman, and then at the badge. He tried to speak and failed, and then tried again, and made a sound that was not a word, but was not nothing. The rider did not ask for words. He lifted a hand, and the other put his hand to it, and they let the weight of that contact say what needed saying. Then the rider swung into the saddle and pointed his pony toward a break in the hills. The badge took the other pony and the man and turned them toward the line of cottonwood, where the first day of the rest of a life can sometimes be persuaded to wait a little while for a pair of tired feet. The woman in the apron watched them go, and then looked up at the sky and told it in a quiet voice that it would have to do better if it meant to scare anyone she cared about again. They parted where 3 stones made a little cairn some stranger had laid long ago to mark a choice. The rider raised 2 fingers to a brim. The badge did the same. The old tracker did not, because he did not need to add anything to a world that already had more signs than most men can read. The man with the bandaged wrist lifted his hand and found that it still shook and decided to let it. The woman set her palm on the rider's arm and left it there for 1 breath, and then 2, then stepped back, because stepping back can be a promise kept when stepping forward would be a promise broken. Across the plains, a hawk took a slow, spiraling path upward. The rider watched it until it was a small, bright thing and then let it go. He nudged the pony. The land rolled out. The sun lifted and put sharp edges on everything. Somewhere behind, a trestle held and a river kept chewing. And a keeper tested a hinge and grumbled and then smiled, because something that had been wrong now felt right, and he would never know why. In front there were hills that held shade, and beyond them another valley, and in that valley a town where a chair might be leaned and a door left open wide enough to let in air. The rider did not know whether he would ever sit in that chair or stand in that doorway. He knew only that a plan had worked, because many hands had tied knots no one would ever clap for. That was enough. By the time the sky turned the color of copper again, the man and the badge had reached the stand of cottonwood. They took the first step into a life the company could not sign for. In the town they had left, men in coats stopped coming by with papers as often as they had. Not because mercy had visited them, but because a trestle where things go missing becomes a story that keeps honest men home at night and sends dishonest ones to look for easier bridges. In the clinic, a kettle sang. In the livery, a wheel turned without telling anyone. On the porch of a house with a root cellar that smelled like apples, a woman sat with a cup and let the steam kiss her face, and did not yank the bell rope when a thump sounded in the lane, because not every sound needs answering when a town has learned which ones do. And under a sky too big for most hearts, a rider moved along a ridge and counted something that was not ties or bolts or lantern swings, but the small beats between plans and chances, the little breaths that live in the hours when a chain lifts like a snake and then falls like a sigh, and a body finds the gap between link and steps through with both feet, head up, toward a horizon that has decided to give back what it took for a while.